The Ottawa Civic Remembrance Ceremony was already 10 minutes into its opening address when the dogs broke. Nobody in the crowd of 300 saw it coming. The November sky over Confederation Square sat low and iron-grey, the kind of sky that pressed down on a person's shoulders. Wreaths of red and white lay at the base of the National War Memorial. City councillors stood in their pressed overcoats. The deputy chief of the Ottawa Police Service adjusted the cuffs of his dress uniform at the podium, and at the far end of the ceremonial formation, 6 military working dogs sat in perfect line, 4 Belgian Malinois and 2 German Shepherds, each one still as carved stone, each one the product of years of rigorous selection and training, so demanding that fewer than 1 in 30 candidates ever made it through. These were not pets. These were federal assets. Staff Sergeant Mac Oduya stood beside his Malinois Flint and felt the usual swell of pride that came with these events. 6 years he'd partnered with Flint. 6 years of early mornings and exhausted nights, of tracking suspects through ravines in the dark, of working security sweeps for heads of state. Flint didn't flinch at gunfire. Flint didn't react to crowds. Flint was, in the measured language of the RCMP's Working Dog Service evaluation reports, an elite-level operational asset demonstrating exceptional drive and environmental stability. What that meant, in plain English, was that nothing rattled this dog, until now. The wind shifted sometime around the deputy chief's 3rd paragraph. A cold gust came rolling in off the Rideau Canal, cutting across the square from the southeast. It was subtle, the kind of change in air that most people don't register consciously, just feel somewhere in the back of the skull as a vague chill. Flint's head turned, not a dramatic swing, just a slow, deliberate pivot of his narrow, scarred muzzle toward the back of the crowd, his nostrils working in quick, tight pulses. Staff Sergeant Oduya noticed immediately, felt the leash shift in his gloved hand. Flint. He kept his voice low, barely a breath. Fuss. Flint didn't heel. The dog made a sound Oduya had never heard from him in 6 years. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a bark. It was a high, thin, keen, almost bird-like, the sound of something deeply buried suddenly cracking open, and then, before Oduya could close his fist around the lead, Flint surged forward. The leash snapped taut. Oduya dug in. The dog hit the end of the lead with the full force of 40 kilograms of pure muscle and didn't stop. And then, with one savage twist of his neck that Oduya would describe later as mechanically impossible, the brass clip hit the stone pavement and Flint was loose. In the same instant, the German Shepherd at the far end of the line, a 4-year-old female named Rook, stood up without a single command, her leash yanking clear of Constable Saria Mendenhall's grip. Then Colt, then Dagger, then Vesper and Trace, all 6 dogs moving with a single intention, their handlers left holding empty leads as 300 civilians turned to watch in stunned, open-mouthed silence. Someone screamed. Folding chairs toppled. A television camera swung wildly to track the animals as they threaded through the crowd. Loose dogs, loose dogs. The radio call went out instantly, and the uniformed officers on the perimeter moved fast, hands going to their duty belts, not sure yet what they were dealing with. But the dogs weren't attacking anyone. They ran in a single, focused stream toward the far eastern edge of the square, past the velvet crowd control barriers, past the stunned security detail, past a gray-haired woman in an expensive wool coat who stumbled backward into her husband trying to get clear, and then they stopped. All 6 of them, pressed together in a half-circle around a young woman who was standing alone near the iron fence at the edge of the square. She was 26, maybe 28, in a canvas jacket that had seen too many winters, its shoulders dark with old rain stains. She wore no ceremonial pin, no lanyard, no press badge. Her dark auburn hair was pulled back in an elastic she'd probably grabbed from the bottom of a bag. She was holding a paper coffee cup in both hands, and she looked, to every person watching, like someone who had taken a wrong turn on the way to somewhere else. Her name was Petra. No, wait, she'd corrected the officer who checked her ID at the perimeter gate. Petra is my grandmother, she'd said quietly, handing over her driver's license. I'm Calla Brigden. She had arrived at the perimeter 40 minutes before the ceremony, asked the gate officer if she could stand at the back. She wasn't on the guest list. She had no credentials. The officer, Constable Dean Lefebvre, had looked her over. The scuffed boots, the jacket, the paper cup, and felt the familiar instinct to redirect her. This is a restricted event, he'd said. Press and invited guests only. I know, she'd said. I just wanted to watch. I'll stay behind the barrier. I won't be any trouble. He'd let her stay. She didn't look like a threat. She looked like someone with nowhere better to be. Now Calla Brigden was on her knees on the cold paving stones of Confederation Square, and every one of the Ottawa Police and RCMP's most decorated, operational working dogs was pressed against her, pressing hard the way dogs press when they are trying to get inside a person, when the distance of even a centimeter feels like too much. Flint had his narrow head buried in the crook of her neck, making a low, broken sound against her collarbone. Rook was on her haunches beside Calla's right arm, pushing her jaw into Calla's shoulder with enough force to rock her sideways. The others circled, leaned, pressed, nosing at the canvas of her jacket, finding her hands, her wrists, the hem of her sleeve. Trace, the youngest of the unit, 18 months old and still learning to modulate his reactions on scene, had folded himself practically into her lap. Calla was crying. Not quietly. Her whole frame shook with it, her arms coming up around Flint's back, her face pressed into his fur. "Okay," she kept saying, barely audible above the silence of 300 people who had stopped breathing. "Okay, I'm here. I'm right here." Staff Sergeant Oduya pushed through the crowd perimeter, his empty lead still in his hand, fully expecting to find a scene of disaster. What he found stopped him mid-stride as completely as if he'd walked into glass. Constable Mendenhall arrived beside him 2 seconds later and made a sound in her throat she would never quite be able to describe. Deputy Chief Ellison Carrow came through the security cordon 30 seconds after that, his face tight with the particular expression of a man who has just watched his meticulously planned public event detonate on live television. He stopped. He stared. The anger didn't leave his face immediately, but something else moved through behind it, something quieter and more confused. "Who is she?" he said to no one in particular. Nobody answered. Nobody in the official capacity of the Ottawa Police Service, the RCMP, or the city's event security had the slightest idea. The ceremony was suspended. The public was ushered back behind a secondary barrier, with the practiced calm of officers who'd been trained for crowd management, even if none of them had been trained for this specific situation. The television crew kept their camera rolling. A sergeant eventually put his hand over the lens. Calla Brigden was escorted, gently, with no real authority, because there was nothing technically to charge her with, and everyone could see the dogs would not be easily separated from her, to a side room in the center block annex, a narrow administrative office that smelled of photocopier ink and old carpet. The 6 dogs came with her. No one tried very hard to stop them. Deputy Chief Carrow came into the room with Staff Sergeant Oduya at his shoulder. Constable Lefebvre stood in the doorway, which was as close to inside as the room's limited floor space allowed. Flint was lying across Calla's feet. Rook sat pressed against her left knee. The other 4 were arranged in a loose, protective cluster behind her chair. Calla had stopped crying. She sat with her hands folded around the paper cup, which was long cold, and looked at the deputy chief with an expression that wasn't defensive. It was simply exhausted, the way someone looks when they've been braced for something uncomfortable for a very long time. "I'm not here to cause problems," she said before Carrow could open his mouth. "I just wanted to see them." "You want to explain to me," Carrow said, his voice carefully controlled, "why 6 operational working dogs just destroyed a nationally televised ceremony to get to you?" Calla looked down at Flint. She reached one hand down without thinking and touched the ridge of old scar tissue behind his left ear. a gesture so automatic it looked like breathing. "Because they know me," she said. The room was quiet. "The official paperwork," she continued, her voice steadying into something more careful, "says these dogs were sourced from a certified facility in Montreal. Fully evaluated, certified under the National Working Animal Program. You paid, I believe, somewhere around $58,000 per animal. They came with full documentation." Caro's jaw set. "That's correct. The documentation is real," Calla said. "The facility is real, but the dogs aren't from there." She looked up. "They're from my program. My name is Calla Brigden. 2 years ago, I ran a small rehabilitation program out of a property near Killaloe, about 2 hours west of here. We didn't have a name that meant anything to anyone. We were just land and kennels and a waiting list of dogs that shelters had already condemned." She said it plainly, the way someone reports facts they have had a long time to absorb. Her voice didn't waver. Her hands didn't shake. But Oduya watched her face and saw the line of tension across her jaw, the specific tightness around her eyes of a person holding something extremely heavy in a very small space. "Flint," she said, glancing down at the dog across her feet. "His name was Finn when I had him. He came to me from a humane society in Pembroke. Severe resource guarding, bite history, had already been returned twice. They gave me 72 hours before he was scheduled to be euthanized." A pause. He was 14 months old. Oduya looked at his dog. Finn, was watching Calla's face the way dogs watch faces when language still holds meaning for them. "Rook," Calla continued, her voice quieter now. "I called her River. She was pulled out of a property seizure in Arnprior. The property was a backyard breeding operation. She hadn't been socialized past 8 weeks. She bit through my jacket the first week. A faint, involuntary flicker at the corner of her mouth. She never bit me again after that. Not once." Caro had stopped pacing. He stood with both hands at his sides. "I want to understand," he said slowly, "how dogs from your program in Killaloe ended up with full Montreal certification documents." Calla's expression changed. The exhaustion was still there, but underneath it something sharper surfaced. "His name is Terence Mole," she said. "He was a regional coordinator for the Provincial Animal Services Board. He came to my property in March 2 years ago in an official vehicle. He had paperwork, zoning violation. I was operating a commercial kennel in a residential agricultural zone. I had permits. I showed him my permits. He said they'd been improperly issued." She stopped. "He said the dogs were being seized pending investigation, that they'd be held at a provincial facility." She set the paper cup down on the desk beside her, very carefully. "He told me that given their bite histories and documented behavioral records, the likelihood was that none of them would be released, that I should prepare myself for that outcome." Her voice was flat now, the specific flatness of someone who learned to stop letting it crack a long time ago. "He loaded 11 dogs into transport crates in under 40 minutes. I stood in the driveway. I didn't know what else to do." The silence in the room was different now. It had weight. 11 dogs, Oduya said quietly. 11, Calla confirmed. "I'm looking at 6 of them." Caro looked at her for a long moment. Something was moving behind his eyes that he hadn't decided yet how to express. "And the other 5. Calla's breath was steady. She'd had 2 years to practice this particular steadiness. "I don't know. I've spent 2 years trying to find out. Provincial Animal Services had no record of an active seizure under my address. Terence Mole processed his own retirement from the board 4 weeks after my dogs were taken. He's been living outside Halifax since then." She paused. "I found that part out myself." Caro moved to the chair across the desk and sat down, which was the first time in the meeting he looked like a person rather than a rank. "Walk me through," he said carefully, "how you ended up here today." 6 weeks ago, Calla said. The city ran a piece on the working dog unit. Promotional content, I think, ahead of the ceremony. It was on the city's social media, 30 seconds of footage of the dogs running a track exercise. She looked at Rook, who had not moved from her knee. "I recognized River in the first 5 seconds. the way she carries her left shoulder. She had an old soft tissue injury from before I got her. It never fully resolved. She lists when she accelerates." Calla touched the dog's shoulder gently, almost involuntarily. "I watched the clip 40 times. Then I filed a formal inquiry with the Working Animal Program through the RCMP's administrative contact line. Did you get a response? An automated acknowledgement. Nothing after that." A pause. "So I bought a bus ticket." Caro rubbed one hand across his face. Oduya crouched down beside Flint, beside Finn, and put his hand on the dog's back. Flint turned and licked his wrist once absently, then turned his face back toward Calla. The implications of what she was describing were clarifying in Oduya's mind, with the uncomfortable precision of something that, once seen, could not be unseen. The paperwork, the Montreal facility, the $58,000 per animal for dogs that a 20-something woman in Killaloe had taken in for the cost of kibble and vet bills and whatever sleep she could manage. The retired regional coordinator now living very quietly outside Halifax. The 5 dogs still unaccounted for. "Mr. Caro," Oduya said without looking up, his voice lower than he intended. "Flint's medical file, the notation about the ear, the old laceration." Caro looked at him. The intake documentation from Montreal attributed it to a wire fence injury during early kennel housing. Oduya paused. "I always thought that was a strange way for a scar to sit. The angle was wrong." Calla said nothing. She looked at the scar behind Flint's ear with the expression of someone who knows exactly where it came from and has never stopped carrying that knowledge. "It was a trap snare," she said quietly. "Someone had set snares on the property adjacent to the shelter in Pembroke. He got into one before the Humane Society picked him up. I drove him to the emergency veterinary clinic in Renfrew at 2 in the morning. The vet's name was Dr. Suki Hargreaves. She'll have the records." There was a moment. The kind of moment that has its own particular texture, where everyone in a room simultaneously absorbs the full weight of what they're looking at. And then Caro stood up and straightened his jacket in the careful, deliberate way of a man deciding what kind of officer he intends to be. "Staff Sergeant Oduya," he said, "I want Terence Moll's full employment file from the provincial board on my desk by end of day. I want contact initiated with Dr. Hargreaves in Renfrew. I want the Montreal facility's certification documentation pulled for independent review." He paused. "And I want someone from our financial crimes unit on a call with me this evening." Oduya nodded and stepped into the corridor to make calls. The room was quieter now. Caro looked at Calla Brigden, who was sitting in the same position she'd held for the past 40 minutes, one hand resting lightly on Rook's head, her paper cup empty on the desk beside her. Miss Brigden," he said, "these animals, legally, pending the outcome of an investigation that I can promise you will happen, these animals may be your property." Calla looked at him. "They might. Is that what you want, to take them back?" The question sat in the room for a moment. Rook pushed her head up slightly under Calla's palm, and Calla pressed down gently in response, an old habit, an old reassurance in both directions. "I live in a one-bedroom in Kanata," Calla said. "I'm working a contract position at a data entry firm on Baseline Road. I don't have the land anymore. The property was sold after the seizure. I couldn't keep up the payments on my own." She looked at the 6 dogs arranged around her in their tactical harnesses, the subdued green and black nylon, the serial numbers embroidered at the collar. They were lean and muscled, and their eyes were clear and sharp. They looked nothing like the broken animals she had pulled from shelters and farms and seizure properties 2 years ago. They looked like exactly what the Ottawa Police and RCMP had paid $58,000 per head to possess. "They're not broken anymore," she said, and her voice was very quiet. "They have a purpose. They have a pack. They have—" She stopped, looked at Oduya, who had reappeared in the doorway. "They have people who love them. I can see that." Oduya looked at her and said nothing, but the way he looked at her said enough. "I didn't come here to take them back," Calla said. "I came because I needed to know they were alive. I needed to know that Terence Mole had lied to me, that they hadn't been euthanized, that all of it. She stopped again. Her composure was real, but it was not infinite. I needed to know the 2 years mattered, that it wasn't for nothing. The room was silent long enough that the sound of the wind against the building's exterior became audible. Then Caro said, "We have an unfilled civilian position in the Working Animal Support Program. It was posted in September, and we've had no qualified applicants. It's structured as a behavioral wellness and enrichment coordinator role. It was designed specifically because the program recognized that our handlers are excellent operational partners, but our dogs' long-term psychological needs require a different kind of expertise." He paused. "The salary is $79,000 a year, benefits. The position is based here, with travel to the RCMP training facility in Innisfil, as needed." Calla looked at him with an expression that was not yet hope. It was the expression that comes just before hope, the moment when a person is deciding whether it is safe to feel it. "I'm not a certified behaviorist," he said carefully. "I don't have a credential." "You took a dog that every certified professional in the Ottawa Valley had written off and trained him into the finest tracking animal this unit has ever fielded," Caro said, and there was no flattery in his voice. It was simply a statement of a thing that was becoming, by the minute, more evidently true. "I'm not particularly interested in credentials right now, Miss Brigden." Staff Sergeant Oduya came fully back into the room and crouched down again next to Flint, who was still lying across Calla's feet. He looked at the dog for a long moment. 6 years, the meth lab raid on Bayswater Avenue where Flint had gone through a locked interior door ahead of him, and the man behind that door had had a weapon that would have ended Oduya's career in a very permanent way. The morning after that, Flint had sat on the foot of his bed and refused to move until Oduya had eaten breakfast. He'd always wondered about that. "He still won't let the kennel staff clip his nails," Oduya said without looking up. There was something in his voice that was not quite humor and not quite grief. "We've tried 3 groomers and the unit vet tech. He lies down and refuses to engage. It's been 2 years. Calla made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "You have to do it when he's half asleep," she said. "After a long run, when he's still in that floaty, boneless stage. You sit on the floor with him, and you do 1 paw at a time over about 20 minutes, and you act like it's the most boring thing in the world." Oduya finally looked up. "That's not in any training manual I've ever read." "No," Calla said. "It's not." They looked at each other across the low, uncertain space of that moment. "What do you say?" Oduya asked. "We could use the help." Calla Brigden looked around the room, at Caro, at Oduya, at the 6 animals who had broken a federal ceremony, and crossed 300 meters of crowded square to find her, and she breathed in slowly through her nose, the way a person breathes when they are taking hold of something after a very long time of reaching. "Yes," she said. "I'd like that." Terence Mole was arrested at his home outside Halifax 11 weeks later on charges of fraud, breach of trust, and theft of property. The investigation, which pulled in the Provincial Animal Services Board, the Montreal Certification Facility, and 2 additional regional coordinators who had each processed similar seizures for private buyers, identified 14 animals in total whose documentation had been fraudulently altered. Of Calla's 11 dogs, 9 were ultimately located. Of those 9, 7 were returned to active service under the amended program records, their files corrected, their original names noted alongside their operational call signs in the case of formal ceremonial events. Finn, River, and the others. The remaining 2 were too old for active service by the time they were found. One was living with a retired firefighter in Sudbury who had purchased it in good faith from a private seller, and who, upon understanding the full situation, offered to keep the dog as a companion animal in a home where it was, by all accounts, deeply and thoroughly loved. The other was brought to the RCMP's Innisfil facility, assessed, and gently transitioned into a program that placed retired working dogs in therapeutic settings, Schools, hospitals, long-term care homes where a calm, enormous dog with sad eyes and a talent for sitting perfectly still beside a person in distress turned out to be more useful than almost anyone had predicted. Every Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, a young woman in a canvas jacket could be found at the Ottawa Working Animal Facility, doing what she had always done. Sitting on the floor of a kennel run, talking quietly to an animal that the official paperwork had once described as irredeemably unsuitable for placement, and waiting, with the particular patience of someone who has learned that patience is its own form of fluency, for the animal to decide that the world had not, in fact, broken it for good. Every time, eventually, it decided.